Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first early career joint talk. In the beginning of the year, we solicited applications for joint talks by philosophers and neuroscientists, as we call them early career, so pre-tenure. Grad students, postdocs, and so on. We've had three pairs who were selected, and the first one, I'm very excited to hear their talk today, and I'll hand it on to we'll have I should say maybe we have one more scheduled for early November, and then the third one's probably going to be early next year. And from here on, I'll turn it on to Mark Hallett, who's going to moderate this.
Right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this first session, which is called Toward Naturalistic Paradigms of Agency. As Uri was saying, these are combinations of a philosopher and a neuroscientist at early stages of their career. And the way that this has worked is that I've met with the two speakers periodically over the last few months. We've had a great time talking about different issues about free will, and I hope that you'll enjoy the presentations today. The idea is that we'll have our philosopher talk first, and then our neuroscientist, and then we'll be dealing with questions. People can speak who are the principal investigators can sort of ask questions, but everybody can ask questions if you put them into the chat. The chat would be preferable to the Q&A, but you could actually put them in either one. Okay, so let me just make an introduction of our speakers then. As I say, this is called Toward Naturalistic Paradigms of Agency. Our young philosopher is Robyn Repko-Waller, who's an assistant professor of philosophy at Iona College, where she co-runs the neuroscience program. Her research lies in philosophy of mind and philosophy of cognitive science, with a particular focus on free will and neuroethics. Her research in the philosophy of neuroscience concerns agency, especially the bearing of computational and cognitive neuroscience on free and morally appraisable action. Elisabeth Parés-Pujolràs is a postdoctoral fellow at the Cognitive Neural Systems Lab at the University College Dublin. She just completed her PhD at the Action and Body Lab at the Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience at the University College London, where she investigated the link between neural precursors of spontaneous action, motor intention awareness, and the neural correlates of evidence-informed self-paced actions. She's interested in the neural mechanisms underlying decision-making, and specifically in how higher order intentions interact with low-level processes. So there are our two speakers. We'll begin with Robyn, and then we'll go to Elisabeth. So Robyn, the floor is now yours.
Okay, great. I'm just going to share my slides. Let me know if everyone can see them. I'm just going to move.
You are on presenter view rather than, okay, perfect.
Okay, great. Thanks, Dr. Hallett, for that nice introduction. I'm excited to be here today with Elisabeth to talk to you about testing agency in dynamic context. So as noted, I'll be giving the first portion of the talk, and I'll start by saying a bit about the key notions of agency we'll be using throughout the talk. So obviously we make an extraordinary number of decisions a day, from innocuous decisions to, occasional anxiety-inducing, life-defining decisions. When I decide what to do, when any of us decide what to do, right, when I decide to pick up this coffee cup right now, I may unreflectively believe it's up to me what I decided, and moreover, that it's up to me when and how I act. So in this case, when and how I move my body. Here, up to me marks this particular sense in which I, the agent, exercise control over my decisions and actions. So philosophers often speak of these goal-directed actions as intentional actions. Now, I'm not going to offer an analysis of intentional action. Suffice to say, we'll take intentional actions to be actions that are characterized by an appropriate connection to our practical reasoning, our intentions, our beliefs, our desires, our perceptions. Here we're talking at the person level. So person level states are those states that are connected to the agents and not necessarily subsystems of the agent. So for instance, I might be said to run along a trail intentionally, in the sense that my running is governed by my intention to run trails that morning. So my starting and continuing the run is due to that set intention, right? Here by intention will mean a mental state that's linked to the agent's beliefs and desires and can be characterized by this attitude of settledness, or as I'll say it today, commitment toward an action plan. Now, this characteristic attitude of settledness or commitment is key to distinguishing intentions from other intentional states, such as desires. So while when I walk in the coffee shop, I might desire to eat a scone, I have a bit of a scone addiction, I intend to not eat the scone because I intend to make better snack choices, right? So desire is more of an inclination or a bias. Intention, we're talking about this commitment to an action plan. I'll mostly talk about proximal intentions today, but people like Al Mealy and others have done a lot of nice work distinguishing proximal intentions from distal intentions conceptually. Proximal intentions are intentions to do things now. Distal intentions are intentions to do things later. For example, my intention to start my run now is a proximal intention. My intention to go to the conference next week is a distal intention. I'll also talk about decisions today. So by decision, I'm going to take that to be a mental action of forming an intention in a state of uncertainty. So when I'm uncertain about what to do, and I resolve that uncertainty. Okay. Now, if we believe that at least some of our decisions and actions, especially our intentional bodily movements, are up to us, we may believe that we are freely deciding or acting at least some of the time. So to decide freely or to act freely is to exercise free will. That's a distinctive kind of a gentle control. Theorists disagree about the kinds of capacities and conditions that would enable or constitute deciding and acting freely. But one shared tenet, however, tends to be that free will is the ability to act freely, and that agents who have free will have the appropriate control over their decisions and actions to qualify as the type of agent who deserves blame or praise for a morally bad or morally good action, say. Now, when philosophers and presumably non-philosophers like neuroscientists make claims about acting freely and intentionally, they're concerned with the control then that agents have over their decisions and movements. And further, it's often implicitly assumed that agents must make at least some of their decisions consciously in order to act or decide freely. So there's this connection to, in free will, we talk a lot about the deliberative context, right, for action selection. So when you're weighing reasons to do one thing versus another. Okay. So in this talk, Elisabeth and I will be highlighting how historically neuroscientific paradigms of voluntary and free action have focused on spontaneous and simple actions, and have focused on the neural precursors of spontaneous and simple actions as the candidates for neural realizers of intention. We want to step back and look at this broader context of voluntary control of behavior and note that the importance of the ability to dynamically integrate internal states and external evidence when achieving your goals, something that hasn't been brought to light as much as it could. So we'll be talking a bit about how do we test agency in dynamic context, and what are the implications for claims about neural realizers of intention and free action. Okay. So historically, as we know, right, in the lab, the focus has been on endogenously generated actions. So these are actions for which the cue for acting does not come from the experimenter or from some external stimuli, but from within the agent. For example, when to press a button during a trial, left or right button, which one to press, whether or not to press the button. Now, in a way, spontaneous simple actions do serve as a good model for intentional and free actions. So, such actions are driven by the agent themselves. And we noted that intentional actions are a special kind of a gentle control exercised by the agent, right? There's also this nice connection here with endogenously generated actions to the agent's internal states. And insofar as intentional actions are those that are marked by that connection to, our person level beliefs, desires, intentions, etc., there's a nice connection there. Moreover, endogenously generated actions, those actions, the agent's not acting under constraint. There's no cues that the agent's acting on. And when we talk about free will, we often talk about choice context and not acting under duress, right, or under influence. So there is this nice connection. We'll talk about limitations of this. Now, obviously, the best known version of this endogenously generated action paradigm is the Libet paradigm when it comes to free will. But, as we know, even before Libet, right, Kornhuber and Dieck in the 60s, they were interested in the neural precursors of endogenously generated actions. And what they did is they used EEG, and using EEG, they found there's a detectable slow negative buildup of brain activity, primarily in the SMA, the supplementary motor area, and the pre-supplementary motor area. When they averaged over multiple trials, so multiple token movements, and multiple participants, this detectable increasing brain activity forms that characteristic ramp-up pattern that we now know as the Baronshaft potential or the readiness potential. And crucially, the RP is taken then to indicate the neural preparation for action. So you see here illustrated that the time of movement is 0, and we see this ramp up of brain activity prior. Okay. Now, much of the interesting work in neurophilosophy of free will comes from the Libet paradigm. So what Libet did that was so insightful, as we know, is he asked how our experience of agents matches up with this picture. So our experience of agents is that our intentional actions are driven by our intentions to act, especially our conscious intentions to act, intentions we're aware of having. And, so my taking that first step of my run is causally due in part to my having an intention to run. I don't just find myself outside running confused, right? Typically, right? So the RP is meant to register the body's preparation to move. So Libet and colleagues simply asked, when does the conscious intention come on the scene? And what they found, as we know, striking at the time, is the idea that the average first reported awareness of intention to move occurs a third of a second after the ramp up of the RP, which is meant to signal neural preparation to move. Okay. So what did they conclude from this? Well, they concluded unconscious brain processes decide, or sometimes they'd say form an intention to move prior to our awareness to move. On this view, when we act intentionally, conscious intentions occur later than the operative intention to move. Now, for our purposes today, I want to point out a few key aspects of this paradigm. So one, this is a static context, right? So both the Libet paradigm and descendant paradigms. It's a static context in the sense that agents don't need to update information about what to do either during action selection or during action execution, in part because this is a simple choice. It's an arbitrary choice, right? Finger wiggles, when to press, what to press. And it's a simple intentional movement. There are some notable exceptions that have been pointed out with the exception to the arbitrary choice context. So there are incentivized, moral, and legal contexts that we've looked at. But that's very much the exception. Of course, we do have this nice feature at the Libet plus paradigm that these aren't cued behaviors beyond at least following the researcher's instructions. And there's a focus on proximal intentions, right? As we know, the limit paradigm's been extended and replicated across neuroimaging methods. Similar results have been found about the neural precursors of voluntary action, using EEG and ERP, using fMRI, using single cell electrode recordings. Okay, and significantly on the basis of these paradigms, there have been a number of conclusions drawn about intentional and free action. So one, the neural mechanisms underpinning task performance on the limit paradigm are taken to be the neural mechanisms underpinning voluntary actions, full stop. This task-related brain activity, in this case, the activity in the SMA and the pre-SMA that underscores the RP, is taken as a neural realizer of antecedents to intentional actions. This is taken in a number of forms. Some people claim it's the neural realizer of practical proximal intention. Some people claim it's a neural realizer of just preparation for the task. You know, we've got this interesting work by Sugar and colleagues about does it represent internal fluctuation in activity? So something more of a passive cause. And insofar as the RP ramps up prior to that average first reported time of awareness of intention, we've got claims that the neural realizer is preempting conscious control. All right, so Elisabeth and I want to talk a bit about going beyond this spontaneous and cued action paradigm. So, you know, with spontaneous, we've got fully endogenous or almost fully endogenous action. With cued action, we've got fully exogenously driven actions. But there's this whole spectrum of action complexity, you know, between that. In this space of action complexity, we can talk about, you know, the fact that agents need to often in real time need to integrate endogenous plans with exogenous evidence. This could be an action selection. This could be an action execution. There's this importance of policy setting. One of the prime examples being the speed accuracy trade-off. And there are other distal endogenous factors we should consider, like distal intentions that the agent has. I won't be able to say much about distal intentions for time's sake, but there's a lot of interesting work there. I just want to give us an operative example of a decision in the wild and how this can vary. So the example is you get on the subway, and insofar as you want to sit down, you need to choose a seat. I think a lot of us have had this experience. So in the first instance, let's say you get on the subway and lo and behold, it's an empty car and all the seats are clean, right? You've got no reason to take this seat versus that seat. You know, this is probably the closest we come to a picking scenario. The Libet's sort of spontaneous, simple picking scenario. Whereas most of the time you get on the subway, you know, the car isn't empty. So there are people here and there. Maybe some seats are X'd off. So there's this exogenous information that's restricting your decision. But also there might be endogenous policies you've set, like I'm social distancing. So I want to take that into consideration when I choose a seat. Okay. Most of the time you get on the subway, it's a crowded car and there's one seat and you're like booking it to that seat, right? Insofar as you want to sit down. In this case, this is really close to the cued action. Insofar as you want to sit down, you got to book it to that one seat, right? There's no choice. Importantly, often we have to change our actions on the fly. So I'm booking it to the one seat and somebody sits down and takes that seat. Well, I've got to inhibit myself from sitting on them, right? I can't sit on the person. And, you know, maybe I'm booking it to that seat. I see somebody else needs this seat more than me. So I inhibit myself from taking the seat and, you know, maybe offer the seat to somebody else. So we're really interested in discussing how these dynamic contexts for choice and action execution tell us something interesting about the neural realizer of intention and also about free agency. Skip this for now. Okay, so if we're going to talk about the neural realizers of intention, we need to be clear about what role are they supposed to play anyway, right? So here I'm just drawing on nothing original to me, but drawing on this vast body of action theory literature on intentions and the role of intention. in action. And the function of intention is sort of divided up into two foci. So on the one hand, we have planning agency perspective of action. And on the other hand, we have action execution. In the realm or the domain of planning agency, we talk about intentions as representing the action plan we've selected. We talk about intentions as related to personal level matters. So my practical reasoning, my values, my perceptions. So the neural realizer of intention should represent or encode action plans, or at least parameters of our action plans, and should relate to person level agency, behaviorally or otherwise. The thing I want to focus on more is this idea that intentions indicate commitment toward action plans. And so the neural realizer of intention should encode that commitment, that attitudinal commitment. Now, on the other hand, we have action execution. So a lot has been said about how intentions initiate motor preparation or action. Not so much in the free will literature here has been said about, how intentions sustain and guide action execution. And I think that's one dynamic context we'll need to attend to. Before I say that, I just want to note, that a lot has been done on how neural precursors to voluntary action do encode parameters of action plans. So people often talk about the what, when, how. A lot of people, I've left people off the slide, right? So what action type? How? Is it a left or right hand movement? When do I press the button, right? Elisabeth and I are interested in how is neural encoding of action plans affected by dynamic, uncertain choice and execution contexts. So when we bring in that dynamic piece, okay, I want to say the most about this idea of commitment. So, we take intentions to encode our commitment to an action plan. And so our neural precursors to voluntary action should somehow encode commitment. And so one way this has been implicitly or explicitly set out in terms of an operationalization of commitment is, well, if one's committed to an action plan, one will carry out that action unless relevant conditions change. So if I intend to meet a friend for a drink late at night, well, I'll meet my friend for the drink unless, things change. Like I remember I've got to get a plane at 5 a.m, right? Now, a number of people have criticized the idea that our proposed neural precursors of voluntary action, and so neural realizers of intention, are encoding commitment on the grounds that, let's talk specifically about activity in the SMA and pre-SMA underlying the RP. We see this present in no-go conditions, so when agents don't act. And while there's been a lot of impressive work about how using neural decoding, we can have fairly, high predictive power in predicting what people will do if they'll use a left hand movement or a right hand movement. This is probabilistically predictive, right? So epistemically, we don't determine what people will do. So we see like predictive power of 60% for a left to right push, up to 85%. So some people have concluded, and it's impressive, but some people have concluded, right? Well, maybe these neural precursors don't per se encode commitment, but just bias or preparation. I want to say that there is an important sense in which these neural precursors to voluntary action encode commitment to action plans. I think we can sort of save this notion if we use an alternative operationalization of commitment. So here's how it goes, right? If one's committed to an action plan, one will tend to inhibit oneself from performing competing action plans. So the idea is to link neural realizers of intention to inhibitory control. Now, if you think that's too quick, if you're the philosopher in the room, here's an argument of why I would link neural realizers of intention to inhibitory control. This is from a recent paper of mine. Okay, so to be committed to an action plan is to rule out competing action plans. Sounds sensible, right? To rule out competing action plans is, if all goes well, to not act on those action plans. And neural realizers of intention should encode commitment to settled action plans. So neural realizers of intention should be implicated in not acting on competing action plans. So that's the link to inhibitory control. I'm not going to be able to get into all the details, but I want to give you a few pieces of empirical support that indeed some of the already identified proposed neural realizers of intention have a strong link to inhibitory control. Here's just a few things we can point to, right? So micro lesions to the supplementary motor area is associated with impaired inhibition to masked primes. Bilateral damage to the SMA is linked to strong utilization behavior. So that's, for instance, when a subject will grab an object and say, use it appropriately, but maybe use it at an inappropriate time. So like kind of perceiving affordances. Talking about the pre-SMA, single TMS over the pre-SMA leads to degraded inhibition response on stop tasks. So that's like when you prepare to make a movement, but you inhibit yourself from making that movement. And using structural MRIs, I think this is really interesting. Gray matter density and pre-SMA is predictive of response inhibition, both for conscious and masked primes. Now, there's other things we could point to in a more distributed fashion about inhibitory networks, but I will leave that in case there are questions and move on. The last important point I want to make about, understanding neural realizers of intention in free action and dynamic contexts has to do with what kinds of paradigms of either dynamic action selection or dynamic action execution would help us to learn these things. I'll just mention, and then I'll turn it over to Elisabeth for that part before I say something further, that Elisabeth's got some fantastic studies she'll present to us about this context in which people are navigating the interface of exogenous and endogenous sources of information in action selection. So moving beyond sort of almost fully endogenous or fully exogenously driven actions. And she'll speak to us about this, about endogenous modulation. What I want to lastly point to is what we can learn about intention and free action if we attend to dynamic action execution. Okay, now obviously, there's a lot of talk about how neural precursors to voluntary action initiate action selection, initiate action execution. So for instance, right, insofar as we take the RP to be motor preparation for action, there's this thought that, conscious control is either bypassed or preempted. There's unconscious initiation of action. So the RP is taken to initiate action, and the RP is just a proxy representation for whatever activity is being represented, right? I want to ask this question of how the neural realizers of intention are implicated in online action control beyond initiation. Now, to motivate this, I'll bring out Davidson's climber case, which the philosophers will know. So basically, Davidson climber case is there's a climber who's scaling a mountain. Attached to the climber via a rope below is another climber. The climber's tired, and the climber wants to rid himself of the weight of this other climber on the rope. And so, might even come to intend to rid himself of the weight of the other climber on the other end of the rope in, say, a few minutes' time, but maybe in a few minutes' time so it doesn't look suspicious. But just so attending to or entertaining this intention in a few minutes' time to rid himself of the weight of the other climber makes him nervous and fidgety, and he drops the rope, and so thereby rids himself of the weight of the other climber. So the intention to rid himself of the weight of the other climber in a few minutes causes him to rid himself of the weight of the climber. And you can ask this question of whether the climber intentionally dropped the other climber, whether it's even an action, right? It seems more like a fumbling. this brings up this idea, and some philosophers have pushed back. Well, it's not just that it's an intentional action if it's caused by an intention, but it's caused by an intention in the right way. And what we mean by the right way could mean something like intentions not only initiate action, but guide and sustain bodily movement. Now, I think there are two possibilities here, obviously. One is that the pre-movement realizers of intention participate somehow directly in guiding and sustaining action. And the other is that the pre-movement realizers of intention participate indirectly by feed-forward connections to other regions of interest, right? In order to see which is the case, and to make these conclusions about free will, we need to attend to ecologically valid dynamic action execution context. And this is where I think less focus has been given than it should. So I'll briefly give you some examples before I wrap up. Okay, so how do we test in an ecologically valid way dynamic action execution context? Well, the focus should be on cases in which subjects need to adjust their initial movement in the space of both changing endogenous goal states, changing exogenous evidence about the environment. Some really promising paradigms to this effect include reaching tasks, including reaching tasks where objects are perturbed, and stop switch paradigms, among others. I'll just give you a flavor of this. In a reaching paradigm, a subject has to grasp an object, whether or not it's static or it's moving, right? Or they need to select an object to grasp. Now, in studies where they have chemically inhibited the supplementary motor area in monkeys, this has led to impairment in the initiation of the reaching, but not in the execution of the reaching. So if they are to have the monkey initiate the action, the monkey can still carry out the action, but the monkey is unable to initiate the reaching action. Whereas if we chemically inhibit M1 in monkeys, this impairs execution of the reaching, but not the initiation of the reaching. Now, some more recent work has been done where theta burst TMS over M1 impairs execution, but not deliberation in reaching tasks. So, this is part of a story that if I had more time, I would tell about. There's this distributed nature of the neural realizers of intention, and many of the neural realizers of intention and action execution, sustaining and guiding, are not the same ones that we talk about when we talk about planning. One more quick note about a paradigm of interest that I think is really important for learning about intention and free action are stop switch paradigms. So these are paradigms with three kinds of trials. One's a go trial. So subjects need to execute, say, a downward button press. One's a stop trial. So they need to prepare themselves to push the downward button and then inhibit themselves from doing so. When cued, the switch task, they need to prepare to push the downward button press, but then they need to switch on the fly to pushing when cued, say, the space bar. Now, an assumption that you can make here is that the neural activity implicated in switch is implicated in online control via that sensitivity to the dynamic environment, whereas the neural activity implicated in stop is implicated primarily in inhibitory control. There's a lot of studies, but I'll just give you this one result, which is TMS over the pre-SMA impairs performance on the stop task, but notably not the switch task. And when we look at switch task, areas like premotor cortex and M1 seem to be more implicated. Okay, so quickly to say, what are the implications then for our neural realizers of intention and free agency when attending to dynamic action context? Well, I think it points to the importance of researchers to expand the scope of the kinds of voluntary action studies we talk about when we talk about free will. In particular, it seems that practical intentions represented in a distributed fashion over the neural activities over time of functionally connected areas, including the prefrontal cortex, which I haven't said much about, or say conscious aspects of intention, premotor cortex, M1, the SMA, the pre-SMA. Now, it might seem pretty banal to say, well, of course, right, intention is represented in a distributed fashion. But insofar as people are tending very myopically to paradigms of simple spontaneous actions when they're drawing their arguments about threats to intentional and free action, and they are, right? And they're coming to conclusions like, you know, conscious control is preempted, conscious intentions are out of the causal loop entirely. They're just a report function. They're post hoc. You know, if we really attend to this distributed representation model of intention, well, we can't put all this work on the SMA and the pre-SMA that underscores the RP. And it's not even clear from the empirical work that the SMA or pre-SMA does initiate action. That's a further question. And does not look like it's involved in sustaining and guiding action, though it does seem to play a role in inhibitory control. So maybe, for instance, things like conscious intentions might be back in the causal loop. You know, maybe they are involved in initiation of action, pre-action, and maybe they are involved in a guiding and sustaining way, right, during action execution. So I think a lot of those old concerns would need revisiting if we attend to these dynamic action contexts and this distributed nature of intention. Okay, I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Elisabeth. I just want to thank Elisabeth and the researchers at Neurophilosophy of Free Will for this opportunity, and I welcome your questions.
Okay, Robyn, thank you very much for your talk. We'll go right on to Elisabeth's talk, and we'll have the question and discussion after both of them, since they're linked talks. Remind people if they want to put questions into the chat or the Q&A, they can do that. And Elisabeth, the floor is yours. Oop, just lost your.
Yeah, 1 second. Multi-screen display issues here. Okay, can you hear me and can you see my screen?
Yeah, everything is fine now. Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Then thanks everyone for joining, and thank you, Robyn, for the nice introduction to the talk, which will hopefully make it much easier for me to introduce the general topic. So briefly here, here's an outline of what I'm going to be talking about. I will spend some more time than I usually would in trying to frame, to keep a framework of the context in which the data that I will present later on are relevant for studying voluntary action. Basically, let's start straight ahead. So as always, one needs to try and start by defining what is the object of study. When setting out to investigate voluntary actions, we should have some agreement on what voluntary actions are. But as Robyn's talk probably made clear, this is not a trivial endeavor. And I'm, of course, not going to try and come up with a definition that everyone will agree on, especially not in a room full of philosophers. So rather, the only thing that I want to highlight is that there is a very broad range of behaviors and action sequences that we engage in our daily lives that would be, under many descriptions of voluntary action, qualify as voluntary, and that we should aim to explain. Now, all of these actions would fall somewhere into what we can call an action space that all agents have, and that could run along these two axes very broadly. But it happens to be the case that actions falling in each of these quadrants of this suggested kind of action space have typically been studied in different parts of the neuroscientific literature. So for example, in the lower right quarter, we would have researchers investigating how people make decisions based on their endogenous beliefs or desires, etc. In the upper right quarter, we would have perceptual decision-making, where there's a lot of work going into trying to describe the mechanisms that translate sensory input into actions when people try to make decisions that are strongly based on the evidence that's coming through their sensory systems. And in the upper left, we would have things like reflexes and reactions, where the margin for control that people have is very limited, either because there's no physiological possibility for them to do anything about it, because it is a reflex, so by definition, there's no option for control, or because they have automated some kind of reaction to specific kinds of stimuli that they may encounter in life. So for example, say a red light while driving, it is a kind of very automatic reaction to brake if one has developed this habit. Now, obviously, what's left is the lower left quadrant, which is the realm of the voluntary action tradition research in the last 20 or 30 years. And just very briefly, one could phrase this, the question that this tradition has been trying to answer, as a question about generation. So because the focus of this research tradition is on spontaneous endogenously generated actions, then the question is, where in the brain, what kind of mechanisms enable agents to generate information such that they can overcome very complicated situations where there's no evidence for choosing one over another option, or where there is no evidence about when specifically to trigger that action. So in this tradition, the big assumption in most of the paradigms that are used is that there is no information in the external world that is relevant for the task that is given to the subjects. And to be a bit more clear in this, this means using paradigms in which participants are given a free choice. So they have to choose between two options which are objectively equivalent and also subjectively. So participants may have to choose whether to make a right or a left button press, or choose whether to saccade to the right or to the left in such kind of tasks, but there is no reason for them to do so. And then the question is, what mechanisms does the brain use to enable agents to generate enough information to not stay still and be unable to make that decision? And at the level of action initiation, of course, there's the spontaneous action paradigms where participants' only task is to execute a movement whenever they feel like it, without any reason for doing so, and without any other kind of external constraint than the experiment saying, well, do this maybe every 10 seconds or so that the experiment doesn't last for 5 hours if you don't move. But the key point here is that agents are capable of initiating a movement, even in the absence of any external stimuli. So again, the question is a question of generation. Which endogenous mechanisms are capable of generating enough information? Now, as Robyn has already said, a particular focus has been placed on trying to relate the neural mechanisms related to action initiation, such as the readiness potential, to our conscious awareness of those processes. So in the famous Libet studies, what was shown was that people became aware of their intention to move shortly before action. And the traditional interpretation was that this left a window for agents to be able to control their movements. So basically to be able to inhibit their incoming spontaneous actions between the time that they became aware of it and the time that was left until action execution. Some other accounts suggest that this may not actually be the case, that people may be confabulating this time of intention and just be retrospectively inferring when they must have wanted to do that post hoc after they executed an action. And of course, an hybrid view is possible whereby this judgment, the time that they report, is actually a composite of both some prospective readout that they had while preparing an action, but also maybe contaminated by information related to the action execution itself. But what I want to highlight here is that even in the best case scenario in this tradition for the free will, for the people that want to defend that there is some kind of control or some kind of free will, is a very, very narrow time window. So considering this range of behavior that we would possibly agree has some degree of voluntariness according to many definitions, the idea that voluntary control depends crucially and almost uniquely on our ability to inhibit or veto these spontaneous actions that we don't consciously initiate and may not even be able to stop is not very encouraging. So the point here is that in real life, most voluntary behavior is not only not spontaneous and in the environment, but actually we seek information in this environment to make our decisions. So before we get to the stage where we initiate an action, we do all sorts of things. We gather information, we accumulate it, and we use that to guide our action decisions. So what I want to argue is that even though the tradition in voluntary action research has been mostly centered around the endogenous generation of actions, most of our voluntary behavior actually involves a certain extent of decision and deliberation and evidence accumulation that would lie around this area of the graph that I'm showing here. And that means that rather than asking, how do we endogenously generate actions or how do we endogenously generate movements, what we can ask is how do we endogenously modulate action decisions? So instead of asking where are the sources of information in the brain that allow us to do things in the absence of any external stimulus prompting us to do so, what we can ask is how do our endogenous states at different moments influence the way that we process the stimuli, the way that we accumulate evidence, and the way that we eventually select or initiate actions. And the question here is that by doing this, by embracing the complexity of real-life voluntary actions, we can then ask things like, well, where is the locus of intentional control? Because it may well turn out that we cannot veto actions that have been initiated when we get to the action initiation stage, but it may be interesting to know whether our capacity to intentionally guide our complex behaviors lies in a broader activity and in a distributed capacity to modulate how various types of cognitive processes, ranging from stimulus processing to evidence accumulation, and eventually funneling down to action initiation, can be tuned or modulated by intentions. So by doing this, we can also move away from the traditional correlates of action initiation and action selection, or not necessarily move away, but complement them by looking at other cognitive processes that are related to other cognitive, to other neural correlates, such as the P300 or the central parietal positivity that I'll be talking about in a minute. And also interestingly, because we are embracing the idea that voluntary behavior involves decision-making not only about internal signals, but also external ones, we can borrow lots of the tools of the wealth of decision-making research that's out there. And then we can try to use those to say something meaningful about voluntary action. So this is what I'm going to try to do in the rest of the talk. We are now going to the data bit of the talk. And what I'm going to try to show with this data is that we can learn a lot from embedding voluntary actions in decision-making contexts that have typically not been used to study voluntary control, but that actually can be very useful for that purpose. That we can understand a lot more about our capacity to voluntarily control our behavior and our actions by looking a bit further upstream in the decision-making process. So by looking at what happens much earlier on, long before we are at the stage where we are about to press a button, how did we even get there in the first place? And finally, that some specific features of agentic control, like the ones that Robyn was mentioning in her talk, like commitment and settledness and inhibition of competing alternatives, can be very neatly conceptualized in neural terms as well, if we embrace this greater complexity of voluntary behavior. So without further ado, I will first get started by introducing very briefly and very sketchily some of these tools of the decision-making sciences that I will argue can help us understand voluntary control. And one of the first one of these tools is one that you will probably all be familiar with, which is the idea that decisions are typically conceptualized as a process of evidence accumulation. So for any decision, especially in the perceptual decision-making literature, the idea normally is that when people have to make a decision, they continuously accumulate evidence coming from the environment, and they start, I don't know if you can see my cursor, they start at a certain point, which we can call baseline, and they accumulate at a certain rate, in this case quite steeply, until they hit a bound. And a bound in this case corresponds to a choice. So imagine that this is a paradigm where people have to decide whether a patch of dots is going mostly left or mostly right. And this is a case of dots going to the left. Basically, this model suggests that as evidence comes in, participants' internal decision variable will drift towards a left bound for a decision, and then they will react and they will produce that decision. So this is the general architecture of how decisions are made and how they are conceptualized in perceptual decision-making tasks. And now for a neuroscientist, what is particularly interesting is to see whether this kind of computational abstract model of how decisions are made has some kind of correlate in the brain that we can track and we can measure. And the good news is that it seems to do have such a correlate. And in particular, a very promising one is the one that has been called the central parietal positivity. And this is a signal that is located on the backside of the brain, so in parietal areas here. And that has a very interesting property that it basically reflects many of the properties that the computational model that I showed you before would predict. So what you can see here on the left-hand side of the screen is the central parietal positivity in different difficulty conditions of a simple perceptual task. And what the dark blue line is illustrating is that when decisions are very easy, this internal decision-making variable builds up very quickly, eventually hits a threshold, and this means that participants will respond fast. Whereas in the red line case, this corresponds to a very difficult decision where evidence is not very strong, and so the decision variable drifts to the threshold much more slowly, which means that participants will make a decision later on. Basically, this graph is just illustrating the same thing. This corresponds to faster trials, to slower trials, and the lines are this neural variable that allows us to see how far into a decision-making process participants are. So basically, building on these findings that we can use some neural signals to track decision-making processes, we set off to investigate whether we could additionally use these signals to also track which decision participants would make in a context that preserves some elements of the more traditional voluntary action paradigms, but embeds voluntary actions in a context where external evidence is relevant. So I'm going now to explain the paradigm, and if I have the time, I'll explain a couple of experiments that are based on the same one. So in this task, what we did was to invite participants to the lab and to show them a stream of letters about which they had to make a decision. What's important is that each trial was very long, and it was of a fixed duration. So they always lasted for 25 seconds. And their task was to look at the stimuli, which were flashing letters one at a time, and decide whether on a particular trial there were more B's and D's, which are what we call the blue targets, or more P's and Q's, what we call the pink targets. And the way that they would report the decision would be by making sure that the background color of the screen at the end of the trial corresponded to the most frequent set of targets. Now, what's interesting here is that, as you can see in the example that's on the screen, at the beginning of the trial, the screen was already of one color. It was either blue or pink. So in some cases, participants were not required to do anything at all. So acting was optional in that sense. It was not compulsory. They were not forced to make a choice, because in some cases, it would already be the case that the screen was blue and the most frequent set of targets were B's and D's. So in that case, participants would just have to sample the letter stream, make their decision, and wait for the trial to time out without doing anything. This was a correct and a valid response. Alternatively, what could happen is that, for example, there were more blue targets than pink ones, but the screen by default was pink. And in those cases, participants would have to press a key at any point during the trial to make the color of the screen change. And so by the time that the trial timed out, at the end of the 25 seconds, the screen would match the most frequent set of targets, and that would be a correct response. So basically, in this paradigm, we kept some features of traditional voluntary action paradigms. One of them is that actions were largely self-paced because they had 25 seconds to choose from. There was no trigger, no go signal during the target telling them when precisely to act. They could just gather as much evidence as they needed and then eventually make their actions. So movements were largely self-paced. And secondly, we varied the difficulty of the task. So in some trials, the evidence would be very strong. So there were twice as many blue targets as pink targets, whereas in other trials, the evidence was basically neutral. So it was always fluctuating around zero. And even if they tried to gather evidence, there would never be strong evidence telling them what to do. So in some cases, their choices would be very strongly supported by what they saw, whereas in others, they would basically not be supported by anything they saw because the evidence was overall zero. So this is the general paradigm. And now, because we had this very long stream of letters lasting 25 seconds, we could not take the same approach as the previous study that I mentioned did, which is to continuously monitor the parietal signals throughout the decision, because 25 seconds is too long a time to do that in EEG. And instead, we took a snapshot approach, where what we did was to look at the evoked potentials by each piece of relevant evidence for participants' decisions. And what's also interesting about this paradigm is that, unlike many other paradigms in perceptual decision-making, each evidence item belongs discretely to one category or another, namely to a type of targets that is telling participants you should press the key because this is not the right type of target, or to another category that is telling participants the background color of the screen is fine, you should not act. And by looking at these evoked potentials throughout the time of the trial, throughout the whole 25 seconds, we could see whether the amplitude of these potentials changed as participants formed their decision, and whether it changed differentially for the two distinct types of evidence that they were confronting against each other. So hopefully the task is clear. And now just a technical note now, because we don't really care about whether people choose blue or pink. We pulled the two colors together. So from now on, I'm going to be showing you the results of these two different types of evidence. In green, as the responses evoked by evidence items that were pro-action, so evidence items that were telling people you should act, and in red, evidence items that were telling people you should not act. And so basically, this is the first bit of data here, where I'm plotting the P3 amplitude across evidence types for all of our conditions throughout the trial time. And the key thing is that on the x-axis, we have the trial time. So from trial start to 25 seconds. On the top, we have trials where people did not move at all. And on the bottom, trials where people did press a key, on average, where the vertical lines are, to change the color of the screen. And what you can see is that from trial start to the time of action in action trials, and roughly to a similar time of around 15 seconds in the trial, the P3 amplitudes build up, so they increase. And this is compatible or consistent with the idea that this is a neural variable that is building up, reaching a threshold. And then after a decision has been made in the action trials, and presumably as well in the no action trials, it goes back down again because people are not sampling anymore. They have reached a threshold and their task is done. They can't do anything else in that trial, so that's it. Now, again, going into the question of, well, what happens for the two different types of evidence? Can we see what people are going to do? What we can see is that this increase is driven by the type of evidence that people end up selecting. So in other words, in action trials, people ended up selecting positive evidence. This means that they acted upon the letters that were telling them you should act. So basically, if they saw lots of B's and D's when the background of the screen was pink, those B's and D's evoked higher P3 potentials by the end of the trial than the P's and Q's did. Whereas in the no action trials, this goes the other way. So in other words, the evolution of the P3 potentials for these two competing types of evidence diverged as the decision was formed and reached the maximal amplitude for the type of evidence that supported a decision. So another way to say that would be that the P3 at the time of action encoded the decision that people made to act or not to act. And this is true, as I said, both when people did not act and when they did act. And it is perhaps more clearly visible when we look at the ERPs themselves, both at the very beginning of the trial. So when we look at the first letters that people saw, and this is at the time when they, of course, had not formed a decision because they had not seen enough evidence. What you see here is that there was virtually no difference in the neural activity evoked by competing types of evidence, whereas at the end of the trial, just before they executed an action, there is a very significant difference in the potentials, showing that the evidence that people have decided is dominating, the evidence that people have acted upon, has reached much higher, significantly higher amplitudes than the unselected evidence. So basically, the difference between these two potentials can be taken as a measure of the decision that people made at the end of the trial once the intention to act in this case was formed. Now, it's also interesting to note that this was the case both in very easy trials when the evidence was very strong and they basically saw twice as many evidence of one kind as they did of the other, but also when the evidence was weak. So when the evidence was basically neutral and fluctuating around zero, we can see that at the time of the action, this neural decision variable that we have identified is still encoding the decision that people made with what seems like a similar strength. So what this suggests is that this neural variable that we are seeing is encoding an internal decision variable and not just the objective amount of evidence that people are seeing, which is very useful if we want to study how people make decisions in all sorts of contexts, not only when evidence is strong, but also not only when evidence is very weak or non-existent. And then one final comment on this study is that we did some modeling to see which kind of parameters best explain the decisions that people make. And we modeled these as two competing accumulator models, where basically people are pitching the evidence that they get for one action option against the evidence that they get for the other action option, here positive and negative evidence. And we found that the data are best explained if we include an inhibitory link between these two accumulators. So what's interesting about this is that there's nothing in the stimuli themselves that should inhibit one accumulator when the evidence is presented, but rather it seems to be like a cognitive mechanism by which the closer people are to choosing one option, the more they downregulate alternative competing plans. And this resonates with what Robyn was saying, that one feature of voluntary action is that, or intentional action is that the ability to intend to do something means also to not intend to do competing things. So one way to interpret this data is that as decisions unfold, as the intention to act or not act unfolds, basically the probability that you will do something that goes against what you will end up doing decreases. So there's like a magnification effect of commitment as the time of decision approaches. And now you might say, well, yeah, this is all fine. You can track the decisions that people will make when you present external stimuli. But where is intentional control in all of this? After all, people are just looking at stimuli and trying to decide which one is present in a greater proportion. So how is this relevant for intentional action? And I will try to answer to give an answer to this good question by using a specific type of intentional control or voluntary control that is easy and has been studied very often in the lab, which is the speed accuracy trade-off. So what I mean by this is that one of the capacities that people have and that are perhaps more easy to observe in terms of voluntary control is the capacity to adjust how much time they allocate to the decisions that they make. So how much time they spend deliberating before committing to an action. And this is a dynamic ability. It's something that can change from one moment to the next and not only from one decision to another. So for example, imagine that you're trying to decide whether you're going to catch a bus or a train to go home later on. You may be pondering, well, the bus may have like better views on the landscape, but the train seats are more comfy, so I don't know. And then suddenly you realize that it's later than you thought, and both are leaving in 5 minutes. So you actually need to run quickly to either either the bus or the train, because otherwise you're not going to catch any of them and you're not going to get home. And the fact that you are capable of basically adjusting and reconfiguring your whole system to meet this new need to actually catch a train quickly is an important aspect of voluntary control. It's not the only one, but it's one of them, and it's one that we can study. And so if we go back to our context of evidence accumulation and computational models, one can then ask, well, if we have a measure of this neural decision variable as it unfolds over time, maybe we can see what happens to this neural decision variable when an internal state that determines how much time one can allocate to a decision. So what happens when urgency changes either between decisions or over the course of a single decision. So there are different ways, according to this model, that one can make a fast decision. For example, we could increase the starting point of that decision. So each piece of evidence, the first piece of evidence that comes in could have a much greater weight and bring us closer to the threshold from early on. Or we could increase the speed at which we make our decisions by basically upweighting each information bit that we get per unit of time. Or we could decrease the threshold so that very little pieces of information, very few pieces of information will suffice to make us decide. And so these are all predictions, or these are all theories that have that make predictions about what we should expect to find in a neural correlate of decision making. And so we can go and test that. So in the second experiment that I'm going to talk about very quickly, we introduced modification of the first experiment that I showed. So in this case, participants were always required to make actions, but not one action, but two. They were required to give us a first quick guess early on in the trial. So they still saw the same stimuli and had to decide whether there were more blue or more pink trials. And they had to give us a first guess. And afterwards, the stream would continue uninterrupted. And they had up until the end of the trial, up until 25 seconds again, to give us a final accurate choice. So they could take it easier after their first initial guess, and they just had to really worry about giving us the correct answer. So basically, again, the same paradigm, but what this allows us to do is to study two things. I'm only going to talk about one of them now. One of the things is to study what happens to this decision variable in cases where people changed of mind and chose first blue and then pink, compared to cases where they didn't change of mind. So we would make a series of predictions about what happens to the decision variable in these circumstances. But what I want to focus on now is on studying which neural mechanisms allow people to make first fast and then slow decisions, and especially what happens at the transition between those two, where nothing in the stimuli changes. The only thing that changes is the internal state of the agent that kind of goes into a slow mode of decision making after they've given us their first guess. Again, we took the same approach. We looked at the evoked potentials by each relevant piece of evidence throughout the task, and we took a particular focus on the first and last pieces of evidence for both the fast and the slow decisions, as you will see in a bit. And again, here I'm plotting the same. We had the same two conditions, either very easy informative trials or very difficult ones. And what you can see here is the dynamics throughout the trial. And what's striking is that, differently from before, the P3 amplitudes start at what is seemingly a higher level than in the previous example. So instead of starting low and then slowly building up to a decision, they seem to already start at a higher amplitude level, which suggests a baseline shift. So it suggests that people are achieving these fast decisions by turning up their response to the pieces of evidence that they see from the very beginning of the trial. And this is what these red lines are illustrating here on the bottom when comparing the dynamics up to the time of action in the speed period of the task and the accurate period of the task. And as for the second question, what happens at the transition? What we get is this very dramatic decrease in the P3 amplitude. So what I'm plotting here is the first and last evidence items that participants saw during the speed regime before they executed the first quick guess, and then the first and last items of evidence that people saw during the slow evidence accumulation period before they committed to their final action. And so the only thing that I want to highlight here is that at the transition from a speed to an accuracy regime, by looking at these neural markers of evidence accumulation, we can see a very dramatic effect of what is not a change in the evidence, not a change in the external environment, but only a change in the internal policy that the agent is imposing on itself. So basically, once they are done with executing this very fast action, this very fast guess, they then down-regulate their responses to the newly incoming evidence so that they can take it easier and accumulate more evidence before reaching a threshold again for their second action. So this is just basically the point of this is that by looking at what happens to decisions when we manipulate the internal state that an agent is in this case, the internal state of urgency, we can learn a lot about how voluntary control over this upstream decision-making processes is achieved. And we can tap onto which specific mechanisms people are using to achieve these sorts of regulations. So I will not have time to go into this, and I'll just jump straight to the conclusion, which is that hopefully I have convinced you that we can learn a lot about how voluntary control of action is achieved by embedding voluntary actions in meaningful contexts where people try to make use of the evidence that they have and where we try to manipulate the endogenous state of the agent to see what is the effect of that state on the processing of evidence. And that to understand voluntary control, it may be very useful to look upstream from the action initiation processes, because most of the voluntary actions that we do start earlier on. So most of the actions that we do result from a very complex decision-making processes where both evidence and internal states are continuously integrated. And therefore, the ones that make it to the action initiation stage have already gone through a very heavy process of filtering and of potentially being controlled. I think that's pretty much it. I'll be very happy to take questions. I'd like to thank everyone that helped me with this work, Robyn and Mark for the help during the presentation, and all of you for listening. Thank you very much.
Right. Elisabeth, thank you very much for your presentation. So we have had two nice presentations, and I think Elisabeth, you're going to stop sharing so we can see everybody. Just to remind the people that are the panelists are the principal investigators in the project, and they're welcome to speak up and ask questions. And those of you who are listening can put your questions into the Q&A or the chat. I can see those. Are there folks who would like to ask question, or shall I? Okay, Tillman, you have your hand raised, so go ahead. You can start with the first question.
Hi. So thanks. It was a wonderful talk. Two wonderful talks. So the one thing that I was wondering is, so you used these philosophical notions of settledness and commitment. I mean, but I wondered whether they, when you discuss the experiments, whether they don't go a little bit soft and might become too liberal, and that I'm not sure anymore whether or not many things that I wouldn't want to call voluntary actions also sound like settledness or commitment. So think of biases or primes. They also inhibit or settle or whatever the system. Does that mean that's voluntary action? So I guess I lose the notion of exactly precisely what you mean by the rather fussy, by the translation of the philosophical notions into the neurophysiological notions.
So I think, well, the key thing is that basically the same, I would say that the same phenomenon can happen due to different causes, right? So you can have these kinds of biases in neurological variables due to things that are not under voluntary control. But the fact that you can voluntarily produce those effects, I think, is relevant. And then maybe by designing experiments where these kinds of modulations are explicitly kind of voluntarily controlled compared to other conditions where they just happen because of some bias or some other control process that is outside of the agent's control, one can tap into that. So I think the way that I was trying to frame it is that we can understand settledness as the capacity that the agent has to configure its decision-making processes in such a way that he can achieve his plans. And this doesn't mean that this configuration can't be altered by other things. So there may be all sorts of other biases and things that interfere with that configuration, but the fact that there is some causal power that the agent has to manipulate what's the starting point or what's the configuration of the system is relevant. I think that's what I was trying to say.
And a tiny little short follow-up. I guess the one worry that you might have is that you're pushing voluntariness now back, because I thought the settledness for the intention, the settledness was supposed to be the definition of what makes it an intentional voluntary action. Whereas here now it looks, well, you know, if this comes about by automatic processes, then it's not voluntary, then it's not an intention. But if it comes about by voluntary processes, then it is. Yeah, but how do we know whether it was voluntary processes or automatic processes in the first place? I'm not sure. I had, apart from intuition, I had a clear sense of what the difference between the two was, whether there was something in the definition of how it comes about that we have the settledness, where we have a definition apart from intuition.
So,
Jump
right, I was going to say Robyn should now respond to that.
Yeah, so just going back to what you said earlier, I think that's right, that we did link voluntary control to inhibition, but I wouldn't say that was all there is to inhibition. So I think a big part of it, at least for me, when I'm talking about, commitment, is this idea that, well, look, I've settled that this is the action I will take. And thereby, in settling that this is the action I will take, part of that involves inhibiting competing action plans. But I wouldn't say it's, just inhibitory control, as you mentioned with the primes case. I don't know if that's helpful.
All right, I think that what we want to do is cover a number of topics. So let's go on to Adina next. She has her hand up.
Thanks. Thank you for your talks. I really enjoyed them. And I'm very sympathetic to sort of a broader way of characterizing agency. And I like this idea of looking at sort of online control as a way of exploring it further and identifying other processes. I think my question was similar to Till's in that there's a real difference, I think, at least philosophically, between the notion of explicitly inhibiting and having just inhibitory processes active, right? So if you have to choose one action and you have, let's say, primed or activated several different competing representations, it's not surprising that you're going to get some kind of lateral inhibition or a winner-take-all kind of process, but that's all very implicit and not necessarily part of the agent itself, right? And so I think that was Till's worry too, is, what's the difference between some kind of active inhibition and just the natural emergence of processes that make it the case that one thing wins.
So perhaps Robyn could try dealing with that first, and then Elisabeth. You're on mute, Robyn.
Yeah, sorry, I just got a phone call that took over my screen for a second. I was not expecting that. People don't usually call me. Yes, okay, so what was I about to say before that? Yes, so I'd agree with you, this could be a concern, but I think that's where we need to attend to the importance of thinking of intention as having distributed nature in terms of its encoding. So I'd want to tell a broader story, not just about, there's inhibitory control going on, maybe subpersonally, but also, that in conjunction with, the agent has, say, settled on this action plan as part of that, right? So maybe that's part of an uncertain choice context, like what Elisabeth's talking about. Maybe it has something to do with distal endogenous factors that cause the agent to settle as they do on the choice. So I would want to focus on, more of the holistic or broader picture of how this fits in with the distributed representation, because certainly I think you're right that, we could talk about like subpersonal mechanisms of inhibitory control that wouldn't be relevant for voluntary action.
I guess one question that there may be empirical correlates of this is, you might think there's a difference between first making a commitment and then seeing signatures of inhibitory processes that follow it versus the emergence of a commitment from these inhibitory processes. But you sort of also wonder whether the process of making a commitment involves inhibitory processes. You don't want to make I think what's Libet's mistake is thinking, oh, this consciousness stuff is first, and then you get all the neural stuff, or you should have, consciousness operate first, and then the brain follows afterwards. Of course, it's not like that. So, so maybe some way trying to tease apart the processes that are person level versus processes that are not might be an essential part of the story.
Elisabeth, do you want to make a comment on this?
No, I think just very quickly. So the bit about inhibition in the experimental part, at least, was more about like forming an intention, where in the process of forming an intention to do or not do something, there are inhibitory aspects playing a role. Whether those are the ones that define that this is voluntary action, I wouldn't think so. I think that what I was trying to capitalize on as being part of a voluntary process is rather the opposite, the capacity to set up the system in such a way that those inhibitory processes maybe operate in one way or another. So for example, if the system is set up so that the decision will occur fast, you may not have control over how the inhibition happens or what stimulus comes first or what action you actually end up taking, but you have been in control of setting up the system in such a way that it will operate in a way that's consistent with your overall goals. So you may not have control over what happens or when it happens, but you have control over how it happens. And I think that this is a relevant aspect of control. So even if this inhibition, in this case of forming this intention, is collateral, I guess that the important thing is that in a slow decision mode, for example, this inhibition will operate in a different way than in a fast decision mode. And the capacity of choosing between these two is, I think, what may matter.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. We're going to go on to the next question. Aaron, you had your hand up next.
Yeah, thanks for two great talks. I really enjoyed both of them. I just want to speak to this idea about inhibition, which I think is important, and I think it's important to point out a distinction between inhibition that's imposed by the task only and inhibition that's imposed by having a body. So if I ask you, for example, if you have a right and a left button, and I ask you to press the right button with your right hand or the left button with your left hand, there is some inhibition probably that's necessary in that context that's imposed by the task. If I ask you to press one or the other button, but only with your right index finger, then that kind of inhibition is imposed by your body. You simply can't do both. And it would be likely, in fact, that the mechanisms underlying inhibition in those two different contexts could be very different. And I wonder if you could maybe speak to that.
Who wants to deal with that question?
I don't mind.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead and then I can answer it.
Right. So just briefly, I think you're right that the extent to which inhibition matters is very much limited by what your alternative options are, by the availability of things, and by how incompatible your action options are, which is what you were saying. So pressing one button or another with the same finger are mutually exclusive. You can't do both. You have to choose one or the other. So inhibition needs to be maximal. Whereas perhaps choosing something that has a more graded nature, so whether you're cutting down on all the sweets you eat or maybe just the biscuits or something like this, is something that doesn't require this kind of maximal inhibition. You can inhibit to different extents what you commit to doing. So I think I would fully agree that the extent to which inhibition matters is very much related to what's the intention that you're forming. Because it can't basically, it can't help your decision equally if you're trying to make a decision about something that has a graded nature and that you could possibly achieve like in various degrees or with various degrees of success compared to when you're trying to choose between alternatives where there's no in between, so to say.
Except I would tend to think that the first kind of inhibition would actually be, the first context would be minimal inhibition. So if I just have one finger, I maybe don't really need PFC in that case, because I've only ever in my entire life been doing one thing at a time with my index finger. I just have no choice. So that's so overlearned in a sense that maybe there is some sort of inhibition underlying it, but it would seem to be minimal rather than maximal, I would think. And that the other kind, the task imposed, probably requires PFC to some degree.
Robyn, do you want to comment on that question?
Yeah, I wanted to say, thanks. This is a helpful distinction to make. Certainly inhibition imposed by the body versus task is very different. And I definitely want to put the emphasis on the inhibition imposed by the task in terms of voluntary behavior. I think that's really where the action's at in terms of our thinking through intentions. And, there's all sorts of interesting work on intention of, can you intend to do two incompatible things at the same time, right? There's all sorts of thought experiments about that. And the thought is no, because there's a rationality constraint, but there also are these bodily constraints that I think would be on intentional action and intention. So I definitely want to put the emphasis on inhibition imposed by the task.
Okay, thank you. We'll go on to Walter for the next question.
So my question might be related to Aaron's, but I want to ask a more general question, which is whether your model allows for degrees of intention, because it seems really odd to say I halfway intend to do that. Am I going to go to restaurant A or restaurant B? Well, like 2/3 intend to go to A. And that seems really odd, but when you think of being the notion of understanding it in terms of being settled, I can be halfway settled on restaurant A, and I can inhibit, changes in plans, but to varying degrees of inhibition. So I wonder whether you allow degrees of intention, which seems a bit odder than degrees of being settled or degrees of inhibition.
Yeah, so that is a good question both for neuroscience and philosophy. So who wants to go first with that?
I can go first.
Go ahead.
So how I was thinking of commitment as inhibitory control, I think I was thinking of more of the on-off, all none kind. But maybe part of this story, and of course I was talking about it in terms of action execution and Elisabeth in terms of planning of action and action selection. But maybe part of this story is, looking at what, and Elisabeth can say more if she wants on these processes, like with the P3, and how this builds up, this inhibition builds up. So I don't know if she wants to say more about that.
Yeah, so I think one distinction is about like what happens before you reach a commitment and what happens after you have committed. So I think that the studies that I showed about forming an intention to act or not act, or to choose blue or choose pink in those processes. So looking at the P3 kind of lets us see the formation of a commitment. So I would say that at that stage, people have not decided what they're going to do, and they are kind of changing the probabilities that they will do one thing or another. And that I would say is akin to deliberating or to trying to decide where we're going to go. Before you have decided that you're going to the Greek restaurant, you will probably be considering different options, and ones are more likely than others, and eventually decide you're going to the Greek. And this means that you're not going to check out the menu for the other Turkish restaurant or Chinese restaurant because you are only interested in the Greek at this point. And I think that the neurophysiological correlate for that would be, so we could look into this if we did an extension of the paradigm where, for example, I don't know, what should I say? So one marker of this could be when people reach a threshold and they decide that they're not going to act and then stop sampling, is kind of they've reached the commitment and then they stop considering that the evidence for changing that commitment. So that is one aspect of it. But then I would say that another relevant aspect, and that's maybe more complex bit of the commitment and intentional action thing, is the possibility of revising this. So I would say that it actually never ends. It's never the case that it's completely fully determined that you're committed to do something and there's no way of changing that, because people are also capable of changing intentions. And this means that they are still somehow processing things that are relevant for that commitment. So I think, yeah, the picture might be a bit more complex, but yeah, key thing is the need to distinguish between formation of a commitment being formed, and then potentially one could study as well what happens when people revise intentions or commitments.
Right. Al has put into the chat the concept of firmness of an intention, not perhaps dealing with these issues about how do you define intentions, degree of intention, firmness of an intention. There are lots of different aspects of it. Elisabeth's work is sort of dealing with the probabilistic aspect, and perhaps that explains a lot of this business of degree or firmness. Let's go on to Pam. She has the last question there, and then we have one more that just showed up in the Q&A. So Pam,
Great.
you're on.
Okay, great. Thank you. And thank you for both these talks. They're both great. So I wanted to ask about the role of the endogenous-exogenous distinction, which I always find difficult. And Elisabeth, I thought your presentation of it early, where it was about like, why don't you just sit there? How is it that people actually bring about a button press? I thought that was very helpful as a way of characterizing it. And I thought so I wanted to focus on the baseline shift at the end of your presentation of the experiment, which I thought was fascinating. But you characterized that as an endogenous process, and it didn't strike me as at all the same as the earlier thing that I thought, okay, I can see what we're after there. And it might be a second separate question. It also struck me as the sort of thing that we should expect a confirmation bias to be in place. So, but my main question is just, why think of that as endogenous, or is that really, I mean, given that the task was very set, specifically very set?
So I think what I try to say is that one can think about endogenous processes as being generative, so they generate information that is eventually the only thing that's driving behavior, or as a factor that kind of sets the background conditions for what happens in the brain. So as a modulating factor, so basically a variable that influences other processes that may be going on, for example, decision-making processes. So the idea that baseline shift that happens during the decision when people go from a fast to a slow mode of action is endogenous, stems from the fact that if participants were in a different context where, for example, there is no requirement for them to slow down, or where they are not changing the way that they are processing the evidence to make their decisions, I would not expect to see that shift. So basically, from the time that they make their action to the time that they see the next piece of evidence, the only thing that has changed is, okay, the color of the screen, but we know that this is not enough to produce this kind of changes, but especially the mode of action that they are taking. So the reason that I characterize this as endogenous is that the only change that has occurred at that time point in the task is the endogenous state of the agent that has gone from a high urgency mode where they are like, I need to act, I need to make a decision now, to a mode where they kind of relaxed and are like, okay, I can take my time and I'm going to look at a lot of evidence and then eventually I'm going to make up my mind. And it is a change inside the state of the agent that produces that change in the correlates, not a change in the evidence, not a change in what they see, but a change in how they process that. And it's in that sense that I call it endogenous. I hope this clarifies.
Yes, but it seems to me the same sort of thing would happen if you told somebody do this series of tasks, right? And so the only thing that would have changed is that they would have finished one of the tasks and moved on to the other. But the cue was do these tasks in this series. So
Right.
so there it feels cued to me rather than anyway. Sorry, it's not a major point, but it's kind of a theoretical point that I'm not convinced that the endogenous exogenous distinction is actually helping us out.
Yeah, if I may just quickly follow up on that, there was a third experiment, the one that I didn't manage to present, which kind of tapped into this, I think, where the thing that I wanted to answer was, well, yeah, one could say that this was cued because they were told first go fast, then go slow. So the cue was kind of in the past, but it was still cued. So it was not really endogenous, despite the precise moment at which it happened varying. And so the agent had to be in control. And so we did another experiment where we let people choose whether they wanted to act fast or act slow at the beginning of the trial. So in that sense, it was not cued. So they could decide whether they wanted to act in a fast modality or in a slow modality. And we compared those trials, the dynamics of the P3 of those trials to trials where they were instructed to act fast or act slow. And the short stories, they behave very similarly. So when they freely decide that they want to go fast, we see the same sorts of modulations to the evidence accumulation process than when they are instructed to go fast. And we see that even when they don't tell us in advance that they will act fast. So they basically make a covert decision that, okay, I'm going to be in a fast mode, and we can tell from their neural activity that they are deciding fast. So I don't know if that goes maybe one step beyond this idea that in the task that I presented, they were instructed, because in this case, they weren't. They were basically free to choose. So, yeah.
So, Robyn, do you have a comment about this as well?
I'm happy to move on to the remaining question if we want to do that.
Okay, why don't we just do then the very last question, and we'll leave that one largely for Robyn to answer. And that deals with that is a question from Zenos Mason in the Q&A. The issue there deals with the mountain climber example. And the question is, basically, does the outcome in the environment matter? In other words, when one is making, as I understand the question, when one making a particular decision in addition to those internal and external things at the moment, does one consider the outcome of what happens as part of the actual decision making? I mean, I think maybe the answer is relatively obvious, but you can comment on it.
Yeah, so why does the outcome matter? And there's also a bit at the end of this question.
Well, it is so the end of the question goes to a ecological model for agency. And I take it the essence of the questions here is in the mountain climber example, the person that you're holding onto in the rope falls to his death. So that is the outcome of a decision to let go. Is that part of endogenous, exogenous in terms of what we're talking about? How does that sort of outcome of what happens fold into the decision making?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the thing that's interesting about the climber case is that's the outcome that, depending on the weaker or stronger versions of the climber case, the climber wanted, or the climber even intended, but intended to do in a different way or later on. So the outcome matches the content of the intention. And that's precisely why it seems like you need to say more for kind of voluntary action about how intentions play a further role in guiding and sustaining action or causing action in the right way, if that's sort of your flavor of how you do it. The last bit of the question, is there a plausible ecological model for agency and spontaneous action? There actually, I had a slide about that, and it's actually one of Mark's studies, but we didn't get to it because we had too much good stuff to say. But I can show this slide briefly, and
actually we are over time.
Oh,
maybe
okay.
you just
All right.
answer it in 1 or 2 sentences
Wow.
if you need one.
Sure. So, there is at least this one study that just came out in 2020, right? Where there are these free-form intentions that were looked at in the lab. So the idea being people being monitored by EEG, and they're just left in the lab and told, don't fall asleep, don't close your eyes. So the idea is anything they do is completely endogenously driven. So, they could fidget, or maybe they make some goal-directed movements, but it's not cute at all. And, it looks like from the results, but I'm not the researcher here, but from the result, it looks like we do see RP-like ramp-ups similar to the Libet study, but they are over the medial frontal cortex compared to proximal intentions we see with the Libet study. So there are some kind of ecologically valid ways we can look at really just fully endogenously generated actions in the lab. Which are interesting studies. Too bad we don't have time to get into them.
Yes, Robyn and Elisabeth, thank you very much. We have gone over time about 10 minutes, so I think we're going to have to quit. It is very interesting to deal with these much more complex questions. A lot of stuff that has been thought about and done in the lab is very simple experiments. And I think taking these questions into natural environments and more important decisions is really very critical. And so thank you for introducing these topics. Thank you for your work in this area. And that's all we have time for today. Uri is not on at the moment, but as he mentioned in the beginning, there are a couple more of these early career talks that will be coming, and we'll look forward to them as well. So thank you very much. This is the end of the session for today.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, Elisabeth. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you. Thank you for joining.
Goodbye, everybody.